Good evening and welcome to Face to Face. For the Newsfirst team, I'm Niresh Eliathambi. My guests tonight are Professor Sirimal Abeyratne, Executive Director of the Center for Poverty Analysis, CEPA, and Dr. Mohamed, Senior Researcher at CEPA. Good evening and welcome to the show, gentlemen.
Good evening.
Right, the topic today is the role of think tanks and researchers in Sri Lankan decision making. And this is something that's very important because throughout our post-independence history, Sri Lanka's political leaders and other policymakers appear to have been taking too many knee-jerk reactions to chart the course of our nation, to take key decisions. And this is not the way that it should be done. It should be done in a more scientific method with all of the facts, all of the research, and all of the solutions considered as well. And this is where think tanks and researchers come in, and they are in fact invaluable. But in Sri Lanka, we seem to have a big issue with a wide gulf between the think tanks and the policy makers who are most often in government and in parliament. So let me ask Professor Sirimal Abeyratne first. Professor, how important is it for all these disparate units to collaborate? We have government, we have semi-government institutions, we have local government, we have the private sector, and we have researchers and civil society. And of course, there is a term that's used in Sri Lanka, which is NGO, non-governmental organization, which can actually mean quite a lot of different organizations. But how important is it for all of these to collaborate and to communicate with each other and to share knowledge?
Very important question. Charting a nation towards prosperity and without leaving anybody behind, and that actually requires collaboration. If you take this issue, poverty, it's not a natural outcome of evolution. It's an outcome of the systems, outcome of policies, and so we should understand that poverty can be eradicated, and it is an injustice. And how can it be eradicated? Because you need to create opportunities, and creating opportunities may not be possible in some locations, and maybe it is quite possible in some locations. And then policies and infrastructure and all these things should change in line with this main purpose. So in that sense, this is not a one person or one organization's activity. That's why it requires collaboration, and that collaboration has to be guided by evidence-based research findings. That's what we also do in think tanks. So the private sector, because the opportunities are created mostly by the private sector. Why do people, if we define it narrowly, the issue poverty on the basis of income or expenditure like that, there are broader definitions as well. And that means people should have better jobs and better incomes. And those jobs and incomes are created by the private sector doing more and more investment in the business sector. So that's why the private sector comes. But the private sector can't do that if the policy environment and if the regulatory environment is not conducive to encourage investment. Then the government has to do that part. And then government also, the local governments also have to collaborate, because within their premises, they also need to take this forward. And then these both parties, the government and the private sector, they all need the policy guidance, and those policies should not be based on opinions or feelings, but evidence-based research finding. That's the important part. That's why everybody have to collaborate in charting our course to reduce poverty.
Right, very well put indeed. Dr. Munas, could I have you come in with your thoughts on this?
Yes, it's a valid question. When it comes to the linkages between different actors working on poverty, one thing that we all want as think tanks is independent analysis of the situation. So that's where the think tanks become important in a context where poverty is a serious problem. So the independent research and independent research findings need to be channeled to different actors for action. So the state authorities as a main party that implements policies need to know what the research findings are. Likewise, the NGOs and the development community, we call them, the development community cannot operate in isolation. So they also need this independent analysis for their own decision making. So that is where the think tank and development cooperation related aspects come together. So they need to channel the information in a way that the development community is able to use. So that's another factor that needs to be included when you talk about the collaboration of different government and non-governmental aspects. So the third would be the international agencies. For instance, the agencies such as the World Bank, the Asian Development Banks, and the international NGOs and the UN agencies, they provide aid to the country for various development-related assistance. So what needs to happen is there has to be a coordination between the state, non-state, and then the think tank to work together to see a meaningful change. So that is why it's important at the current situation that we pool the resources together for the maximum benefit so that the people can benefit from that and we can create a meaningful change.
Right. Now, Professor Sirimal, both of you mentioned poverty. And that is the result, isn't it? And it's the result of policy making, bad or good, in many other spheres. Now, if you take Sri Lanka's high level of poverty, it is reducing over the last few years, but it went up to something beyond 25% in, I think, 2021, 2022. And that was the result of bad financial policy making, wasn't it? Which led to the economic meltdown. And then the consequence was that millions of Sri Lankans got thrown below the poverty line. So whatever sphere it is, whether it's the legal sphere or medical, educational, financial, it all impacts on poverty, doesn't it?
It does. I think that episode that you mentioned is a classic example of how poverty is created by the system, by the policies and so on. When we look at the 25 years ago situation, in fact, poverty was about 1/4 of our population was estimated to be below the poverty line. That means they were considered to be poor at that time. So there was a gradual decline until 2019. That is the last official data we have. And then after that, COVID pandemic and then the economic crisis. And now we find that we are back to square one, saying again, about 1/4 or even more than that, 1/3 of our people are below poverty line. So it shows that there is something wrong. How suddenly it became such a bad situation in this country because the crisis, and we have earlier we talk about crisis in all over the world, not in Sri Lanka, but now we all experience what the crisis means. So during the crisis time, the inflation, we know that 60-70% inflation, so which means actually people's income 50% more than half of the income has been wiped out. So people suddenly become poor. And then we introduce new policies and new tax systems to cope with this crisis. And that actually create another unfortunate situation for people to cope up with. So and the business collapse and people lost jobs and livelihoods. So with all these things, we see people falling below the poverty line. So that's why we can see that the systems, create poverty. And then there is something wrong in this whole process because the Sri Lankan economy got vulnerable to the external shocks so much. The COVID pandemic is not exclusive to Sri Lanka alone. It's a global health crisis. So there were many other crises facing this, many other countries all over the world facing this health crisis. But not all of them fell into this kind of crisis. So which means our economy has something wrong. And that part has to be corrected, which is actually why we need to create a resilient economy so that when we improve our poverty reduction episode again in the coming years, and then within the next 10, 20 or 25 years, we will improve our living standards of people and taking people out of poverty. But that has to be sustainable. The poverty reduction strategy, not letting the people to fall back again when there is a crisis hit, because crisis comes all the time and that's not something unusual. Some are global, some are local, some are natural, internal, some are man-made like wars. So we should have that economic resilience to face all these things, and that's not overnight. You can't do that, but it's a gradual process of improving the economic status of the country so that people become more resilient to those crises.
Now, Dr. Manas, may I ask you to explain a little bit about the scientific methodology which researchers and think tanks use to come up with the knowledge, with those wonderful reports which you all disseminate, and I hope the policymakers do read. But these are not just opinions that your staff puts out. They are actually rooted very much in the actual facts on the ground. It's not your researchers sitting there in their offices and reading things on the internet. It is actual research being done throughout the country, and also you're tapping into research that's being done around the world, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it's an important question, especially when it comes to think tanks and research organizations. Like you said, you don't really sit in one place and do the research. There's one part that belongs to it. Let me briefly explain, the process we take. When we start a research, what we do is we do something called desk research or literature review, where we look at the existing knowledge. So what kind of scholars have done the similar work, and what have they said, and what are the key takeaways from the existing knowledge. And then you actually develop a research methodology and design it in a way that you combine both the existing knowledge and also the knowledge you gather from the people. So the knowledge that we gather from the people, in our term, research term, we call it primary data, right? There's data that already exists within the published literature, or it could be the statistics published by the government. They are already there, which we can make use of. They are secondary data, and then we collect the primary data from people through interviews. Like we talk to people, and trying to understand their lived experiences and their challenges, and their expectations from the policymakers. So that's through the primary data collection. And then we also collect, if there's no sufficient secondary information within the government sector or within the existing literature, and then we conduct surveys. So it could be representative surveys that you conduct in targeted locations, like selected districts, selected provinces, and then collect that data, and those are all processed in-house, and then we go through the data processing exercise, and then it goes through the analysis process. We then researchers then reflect on what comes out from this primary and secondary data. So that's the analysis process that kind of we invest quite a bit of time on that, trying to understand what are the new things that we are learning in addition to what's already existing, which is like from the literature. And then these will be tailored according to the could be the audience, for instance. If you are targeting politicians, then you design your communication in a way that the politicians can quickly grasp and then make use of the knowledge for their own purposes, policy making purposes. If they are if the audience is different, and then we use alternative methodologies to channel the information. So that's the process, from design to the communication. So you basically engage in various steps of research work. Yeah.
Right. So, Professor Sirimal, what Dr. Manas described here is, to me, it sounds very much like you learn from the history, including what other researchers have uncovered around the world. It may be past history or very recent history. And then you also learn about the contemporary situation, what's going on in other countries, and also in Sri Lanka itself, through the surveys and interview processes. But also, I believe you use key resource persons as well, experts in particular fields, to bring more knowledge together. Would you like to tell us a little bit about that?
Yes. In our organization, we have a set of researchers, experts in different fields. When we don't have those very specific research knowledge, then we actually bring them from other institutions like that. So then we pool together all these different knowledge partners, these researchers, and then because the issues that we are dealing with, these are multi-dimensional, and then you need social scientists coming from different disciplinary fields, and they need to bring their knowledge into this exercise and then come up with the research findings, as Dr. Munas mentioned, following that process from design to communication. So this activity is called the research process, and I think all the think tanks follow this process and then bring out evidence-based, the scientific research findings, which are implemented maybe somewhere else. You look at the existing knowledge and to find out what the others have said, what it has been approached in other countries, and then to what extent we can replicate it, or to what extent we can modify it to suit our situations. And as such, to give a very broad and very simple example, now we take the same issue that we have been talking about, poverty. Now, the most recent examples in the world we find poverty, regarding poverty reduction, one is China, other one is India. And those both countries have over 1 billion population, and also quite 100 millions of living in poverty a few decades ago. In fact, there were millions dying also in China before their policy reform process. So, but over the last 25-30 years, China has been able to, according to the literature, what we refer to, we find that China has been able to lift 800 million poor people out of poverty. And similarly, India, which has been following the same path, similar path recently, has been able to lift 450 million people out of poverty. So how they have done that? So that is where we find this existing knowledge is important, and then how we can do the same thing, and then to suit our situations, and then lift up our people from poverty. So this is a very broad example that I brought, but if you are looking at something very unique situations in locality, and then we follow the quite micro level research process like that. So this is how we actually combine the existing knowledge and make use of that, and then on that basis we build up our own cases.
Right. So, Dr. Manas, you can't just take problems and solutions which are found in other countries and transplant them here. You need to adapt them, don't you? Now, we had many presidents in this country who said, we want to make Sri Lanka the next Singapore. We should emulate them and become like Singapore. And yes, it would be lovely to do that, but it's not practical, is it? Sri Lanka is far different to Singapore in many aspects, in terms of the population, education standards, and many other like economy and so on. So you can't just suddenly within a year or two become Singapore. So you need to adapt solutions to our own country, don't you?
Yeah. I mean, that's an interesting question, because I mean, we have been as a nation, we have been looking at other nations, and we have been saying we should become a Singapore, we should become another country like. Although I mean, Sri Lanka, I mean, yes, we did look up to certain countries, but if you look at the situation, like improvement over time, for instance, our poverty reduction, Professor mentioned earlier that we had, for 25 years ago, we had 20 to 25% poverty. And then now we are again back to the similar situation when it comes to the head count of poverty. But we have seen a drastic reduction of poverty since 2000 period, early 2000. And if you compare 2019 period, the poverty was around 8%. But then it suddenly, increased because of various crisis-related incidents. So, what is when you compare the movement out of poverty, how many people moving out of poverty, for instance. Yes, the other countries had significant shift because of their policies. Sri Lanka did have certain policies. For instance, early 70s we had this, early 70s and 80s we had this food stamp kind of food related poverty reduction strategies, and then we moved into Janasavya and then Samurdhi, and then now we are into Aswasuma program. So we did have various poverty reduction strategies. What we didn't have is a program that looks at poverty reduction in a scientific way. So, for instance, just an example, in Samurdhi program, when we had the program, we also had an intention to move people out of poverty. So when people move out of poverty, they have to be taken off the Samurdhi list or Aswasma list. So it didn't happen to a large extent. So then the programs became less effective. So as a result, the long-term programs we had, the poverty reduction strategies that Sri Lanka had over time were not really effective in identifying poor people at a critical juncture. For instance, during 2023, when we had the crisis, and we could not identify the new poor, we had to roll out a new program to collect data and identify who is in poverty. So if we had that kind of a information system in place, we could have identified and then rolled out a program for them instead of collecting new data. So that is why it's important that we have our own systems that is more contextualized to Sri Lanka, and then we can resolve the issues in an effective manner.
Absolutely. You are watching Face to Face. We need to take a short commercial break right now. Don't go away. We'll be right back.
මගේ වයිස් එකම කොහොමද දෙන්නේ? එහෙම බැලුවා. මට දුන්න ඔක්කොම කලින් කෝච් යසස්ව කන්ට්‍රෝල් එකට ගත්තා නම් හොඳයි කියලා. රිටර්න් එක එකට දෙක බැගි. සිටිජේගේ බර්ත්ඩේ ගිෆ්ට් එක දෙන්න යනවා. විශාල. Boys Team Season 3 සතියක රාත්‍රී 8:30ට.
ඔයා හරි පරිස්සමට ඔයාගේ හිත, කය, වචනය තුන සංවර කරගෙන ඉන්න ඕනේ අසා.
මට වෙලාවකට හිතෙනවා ඔය දවස් දෙක තුනක වැඩකට කියලා ගියා කියේ මොකක් හරි රණ්ඩුවකට කියලා.
කොල්ලා මාත් එක්ක කතා කර ඉද්දිම පොලිස් කාර්යයේද කොහෙද ඇවිල්ලා ෆෝන් එක ඉතුරු ගත්තා.
හෙට රාත්‍රී 8:30ට
සිරස ටෙලිතිරයෙන්
මේ හැම සතුරෙක්ම ලෑස්ති වෙන්නේ අපෙන් පලිගන්න.
ලේහලන එකයි මිනිමරණ එකයි හරියට අපේ රටේ සම්ප්‍රදායක් වගේ.
මම ඊයර තරහගෙන් වාට ගැහුවානේ සිතු මහත්තයා.
මොකද කිව්වේ? බැන්දට පස්සේ ওই වචනේ ඇහුවමයි.
ඔයා කතා කර එනවා විතරයිනේ මං ඉන්නවා කියලා ගානක්වත් නැහැ.
මේ මොකද? හෙට රාත්‍රී 9:30ට සිරස ටෙලිතිරයෙන්.
උඹ ඇත්තටම ওই තාර පැටි කිව්ලවුද?
අනේ අපේ අංජනයටත් ඔය වයි කෙල්ලි සෙට් වුණා නම් ෂෝක් නේද?
වදුනේ?
අම්මි මං ගන්න. අනිත් එක මට රෙහානු නලව ඉන්න වෙලාවක් නැහැ, මට වැඩ තියෙනවා.
උඹට හංසයන්ගෙනුයි තාරාවන්ගෙනුයි ගැලවීමක් නැහැ.
එහෙනම් මූත් එන ගේමක් ගහන්න. ඒ කියන්නේ මුගේ යටත් දෙන්න හොරෙක් ඉන්නවා.
අයි මේක පොත තියෙනවද? අයි පොත උඹ මට ලීසියක්වත් දෙන්නද?
අහංකාර ආදරේ.
හෙට රාත්‍රී 9ට සිරස ටෙලිතිරයෙන්.
Welcome back to Face to Face. I am with Professor Sirimal Abeyratne, Executive Director of the Center for Poverty Analysis, and Dr. Mohamed, who is a senior researcher at the same center. Professor Sirimal, your institution is celebrating 25 years of service to the nation. And there are, I believe, some key, I wouldn't call them celebrations, I would call them key events which you all have organized and I think took place over the last few days. Would you like to tell us about these key scientific sessions?
Yes, it was about the to mark this 25 years anniversary, and we had this international 2-day international conference in Colombo with, of course, international participation as well. And we partnered with the Asian Development Bank as well as ODI Global in the UK, and their presence was also there, and then some of our neighboring countries and researchers participated in those countries as well. This was actually a timely event because the crises have been global during these last couple of years, and if we start from 2019 COVID pandemic, there have been several of crises affected all over the world, nations. But we also had very exclusive events, external shocks within the country. So the ultimate problem of all these things, as we have seen, people's massive increase in poverty levels in the country. So there are certain global aspects also. That's why I think we need to have a fresh look at the poverty and also their development in times of crisis. Should we follow the same patterns and same policy prescriptions that we have been following over the last 25 years, and what would be the next 25 years that we should do, starting from right now, and then how do we respond to the crisis time poverty increase, and then charting our development path towards the next 25 years, and then becoming a prosperous nation, at least when we celebrate the 100th years of our independence. And by that time, so how do we build that resilient economy? How do we improve our economy? And how do we take our people, those who have fallen down below the poverty line, back to their normal life and improve their living standards? So this is the main focus of the conference that we organized, and bringing experience from many different countries and many different researchers. In fact, we had more than 100 applicants applying for the conference presentations and panel discussions. So this is the outcome of that conference.
Excellent. And Dr. Munoz, would you like to share your thoughts on the conference and the associated workshops?
Yes, Professor Sirimal already shared a kind of snapshot of the conference. I would like to step back a little bit and think about the 25 years. As an organization, CEPA has contributed, so this 25 years anniversary is also to reflect on what CEPA has done to the poverty analysis, and also the kind of policy influence that CEPA had, also CEPA tried to influence. You may not be successful in every policy influencing exercise, but as an independent organization, we have been trying to fill that gap of policy analysis. So when CEPA was instituted, conceived as an organization, there was a vacuum to look at poverty from a grassroots perspective, from a grounded perspective, to bring out certain voices of people in a way that it can impact, it can bring out policy changes for them. So at that point, the poverty was 25%. It's not just a number, the sectoral variation was also quite high. The urban poverty was less, whereas the estate was much higher. The estate poverty was much higher. Even the rural poverty was high. So that was the situation when CEPA was conceived as an organization and established as an organization to provide an independent analysis of poverty, monitor poverty situation, and tell the donors, tell the civil society organization, tell the government that, you know, these are the missing dimensions of the poverty. And you need to understand that poverty is not just about the numbers. So CEPA believes in that. So it's not just about how many people live below poverty line. It's also about the quality of life. It's also about the other dimensions like education, health, social development, social inclusion, and how people, you know, should be, you know, living with dignity. So these are the aspects that CEPA, you know, when CEPA celebrates the 25-year and completion, these are the aspects that we are proud of, that, you know, we were able to talk about this. For instance, gender equality, gender differences. So how men and women are differently affected by various crisis situations, and through this, we are hopeful that we will be able to continue this kind of analysis even beyond 25 years, because even when the poverty numbers, the absolute numbers reduce, there will be social inequalities. There will be aspects that, you know, affects men and women differently. So we are trying to, as a Center for Poverty Analysis, we will be bringing those voices beyond 25 years as well. So we want to continue that journey and contribute to the analysis, and also, you know, make a difference. So that's why the 25th anniversary for me as an employee at CEPA is important.
Right. Now, Professor Sirimal, it strikes me that while such research, think tanks such as yours are important the world over, they are much more important in countries like ours, where we have limited financial resources. Our society, our government, our private sector, we have limited funds, basically, and we have to decide where and when to allocate those funds, and misallocation of funds will lead to less funds for key projects which would alleviate poverty. So, for example, if you build an airport in the wrong place, or a port in the wrong place, or have a highway built to nowhere, well, that money, that funding could have been put to much better use. So it's quite vital in a country like ours that think tanks such as yours should be contacted and should be part of any such national policy making process, don't you think?
I do think so, absolutely. And then that's why actually we also partner with many of our development partner organizations such as UN agencies and World Bank and Asian Development Bank, and they do require research findings when they design their country partnership strategies and so on. And also we have also taken a step within our organization, because the new changes are also coming up. For example, we all know that the climate change and the biodiversity loss, and Sri Lanka is a very specific case, and these are also part of the poverty analysis as well, because we can't ignore the poverty related to climate change or poverty related to the land use pattern in this country. And then if you look at the last Ditwa cyclone impact on people's lives, most of the people who got affected by this natural disaster are poor people. And then that's why we cannot, because I think we will increasingly experience these kind of natural disasters in the future as well, because the global warming and all these things are happening. So we also need to expand our working premises to incorporate those areas into our analysis, and we have done that. So this is also the areas that the development partners are also working in. They also want to change their course of action in the context of emerging new situation and the global dynamics. I think the government should also change their policy direction, and they should also look at how the policies can become sensitive to many of these surrounding areas, and then all these things require research inputs, because you can't do that haphazardly, and you cannot make use of putting things and wasting funds, and most of the funds are coming from as loans, soft loans or commercial loans, but we cannot make let them go wasted without making the maximum use out of those funds. And that can be done only if we know exactly this is the better situation, this is the better alternative, rather than among many other alternatives available. So these things should be guided with principles, with theories, and with evidence-based research, not by opinions, not by feelings, and not by political motives.
Absolutely. And taking up from that point, Dr. Munoz, could you give us some examples of your research at work? For example, with the economic crisis or with Cyclone Ditwa, what are the new challenges that you found, that your team found, that low-income families or rural communities would face from, when you compare it to the previous situation?
Yeah, thank you for that question. It has happened. I mean, Professor Sirimal already alluded to it, that people have fallen into poverty because of the crisis. The most recent crisis is Ditwa, but economic crisis, Ditwa, and then COVID. So these were all, subsequent crisis situations.
And
that
now we are
people
facing another crisis with the global, the Middle Eastern war going on.
So there's no short of any crisis, and then we have become vulnerable to all shocks, internal shocks and external shocks. So there is new poverty that is kind of emerged because of these external shocks. So people's livelihoods are not sustainable enough. So they are not resilient enough to give, cope with the external shocks. The examples would be, if you are a tourism based entrepreneur, the current crisis that's happening in the Middle East certainly has affected. People say their bookings have been cancelled, and the prices have gone up. The fuel prices have gone up, and only tourists from certain countries would travel to Sri Lanka. The high-end tourists would not come to the country because they think it's not safe to travel via the Gulf region, so they go to the alternative locations. So that particular area is totally affected. And Ditwa, for instance, it kind of affected everyone. Look at the places like Gampola, for instance, and also the Kandy area, where people have been engaged in various economic activities, and they lost the assets completely. So that's a new form of poverty. Then they had to build from the scratch. Their livelihoods are affected, and they are I don't know to what extent they can access the insurance services. So most of them did not have the insurance facilities. So those livelihoods are affected. And the economic crisis, we know, and Professor indicated that the taxation and then also the increments in the bills and inflation, everything pushed people's their level of expenditure for food and non-food related purchases have gone down drastically. The food security is a big problem, has been a big problem during the crisis time, because people were skipping meals. There was clear evidence from UN agencies saying that the families reduced the number of food intake. And certain members of the families did not take food. For instance, the women, they prioritized the children and working men, and then women took the brunt of the crisis. Then, their nourishment, their food security, nutritional security, all affected. So various crises in different ways affected different, communities.
The vulnerable communities.
Yeah. And there's also a community, a group of people who could be not non-poor, but they are just above the poverty line. So, and a small crisis, a small shock can bring them down to the poverty, below the poverty line. So, I mean, that's the vulnerable situation that we are talking about. So that's why it's important that we have, sustainable livelihoods. We also have resilient livelihoods. Most of the, if you look at the rural areas, their livelihoods are dependent on natural resources. So when a natural disaster happens, they are susceptible to that, because they have not included any technological advancement. Like, for instance, people are not engaged in smart farming. Right? If it's smart farming, then you can control the environment to some extent. So it's not the crops are not affected by the rain and drought. So we have not gone that far yet when it comes to agriculture, but the agriculture is completely natural resource dependent, and it's easily affected by the negative weather or extreme weather events, and then they become more vulnerable, and then they are affected by the shocks.
Right. So I think you gentlemen have certainly emphasized the need for policymakers and for society as a whole to take more heed, more cognizance of the research that is being done by think tanks and researchers, and that in fact the knowledge is available and it just needs to be looked at more carefully, and policy making has to be based on such evidence, not just of the evidence of the problems, but the evidence of solutions as well. And I'm afraid we are out of time. My thanks to my guests this evening, Professor Sirimal Abeyratne, the Executive Director of CEPA, and Dr. Mohamed, who is a Senior Researcher at CEPA. Thank you very much for joining me, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for hosting us.
And thank you to you at home for watching. Don't go away, because the news is coming up next. Have a great evening.